Howard Mitchell has lived alone in Millbrook for 30 years. Every morning, he feeds the stray cats that visit his porch, never expecting them to change his life. But today is different. A small grey kitten refuses to eat, instead pawing at his legs and meowing insistently. When Howard follows the kitten, it leads him to an old Victorian house at the end of Cedar Street. The house has been empty for decades, its windows dark and shutters crooked. Inside, Howard discovers a dust-covered room, filled with old photographs, letters, and a familiar face that makes his heart stop. Could this abandoned house hold the answer to the family secret he's been running from since 1962? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, Howard Mitchell's alarm clock shattered the silence of his modest ranch home. He never needed it. His internal clock, honed by decades of routine, usually woke him a few minutes before, but he set it anyway. Structure, he believed, was the foundation of a well-ordered life. His coffee-stained daily planner lay open on the kitchen counter, each hour meticulously mapped out in cramped handwriting that had grown shakier over the years. The morning's schedule was identical to yesterday's, and the day before that, 6 a.m. wake, 6:15 a.m. coffee, 6:30 a.m. feed cats, 7 a.m. breakfast. The planner's pages were dotted with coffee rings and the occasional paw print, silent testimonies to the intersection of order and chaos in his life. He ran his finger down today's entry, touching each time slot as if to confirm their reality. 30 years of solitude had taught him that routine was a kind of company. In the kitchen, he performed his morning ritual with mechanical precision. The coffee maker gurgled to life, a sound as familiar as his own breathing. 3 scoops of medium roast grounds, filtered water up to the 6-cup line, though he only ever drank 2. The rest would sit until it grew cold, a habit his wife used to chide him about. "You always make too much," she'd say, but some habits were harder to break than others. While the coffee brewed, Howard stood at his kitchen window, watching the pre-dawn darkness slowly give way to grey. His backyard was small but neat, with bird feeders hanging from the maple tree he'd planted when he first moved in. The tree had been just a sapling then, barely taller than he was. Now it towered over the house, its branches spreading wide enough to shade half the yard. The first cats usually arrived around 6:25. Howard could set his watch by them, particularly by old Tom, a battle-scarred tabby who'd been visiting for at least 7 years. The neighborhood strays knew Howard's schedule as well as he did. They gathered on his back porch, a motley assembly of forgotten felines who'd found in him a reliable friend. "Good morning, committee," Howard murmured, pulling a bag of cat food from beneath the sink. The familiar rustle of the bag brought more cats slinking out of the shadows. Patch, the black and white tuxedo with a torn ear. Princess, a long-haired calico who walked with imperial dignity, and usually 3 or 4 others who came and went with the seasons. But this morning was different. As Howard stepped onto his back porch, coffee mug in one hand and measuring, cup of cat food in the other, he noticed a new face in the crowd. A small grey kitten, no more than a few months old, sat apart from the others. While the regular cats clustered around Howard's feet, meowing their impatient demands, the kitten remained still, watching him with unusual intensity. "Well, hello there," Howard said, setting down his coffee mug on the porch railing. "You're a new one." He poured out portions of food into the row of plastic bowls he kept lined up against the house. The regular cats fell to eating with familiar enthusiasm, but the grey kitten didn't move. Howard frowned. In his experience, hungry strays never refused food. He poured a little extra into a bowl and placed it closer to the kitten. "It's all right," he coaxed. "Plenty for everyone." The kitten stood up, and Howard noticed it had unusual markings. Grey all over, except for a perfect white circle on its chest, like a full moon against a cloudy sky. But instead of approaching the food, it walked to the edge of the porch and looked back at him, meowing with what seemed like deliberate purpose. Something about the kitten's behavior stirred an old memory in Howard, a half-forgotten fragment of his childhood, when he believed animals could be messengers from another world. His mother used to tell him stories about spirit animals that guided lost souls home. "Nonsense," his father would say. "Animals are just animals." But this morning, watching the grey kitten's insistent behavior, Howard wasn't so sure. The kitten meowed again, more urgently this time, and took a few steps down the porch stairs, still looking back at him. Howard glanced at his planner, lying open on the kitchen counter through the window. 7 a.m. "Breakfast," it declared in his careful handwriting. He hadn't missed breakfast at 7 in years, but sometimes, he thought, picking up his coffee mug, even the most carefully planned life needs a little disruption. Howard hesitated at the bottom of his porch steps, coffee mug still warm in his hands. The grey kitten had moved to the sidewalk, its unusual white circular markings seeming to glow in the early morning light. His mother's voice echoed in his. "Memory. Animals know things we don't, Howard. They see what we miss." He hadn't walked through the neighborhood at this hour in years. The streets of Millbrook were different in the dawn light. Familiar houses, rendered strange by long shadows and dew-dampened lawns. The kitten trotted ahead, stopping every few yards to ensure he followed, its tail held high like a flag. "This is ridiculous," Howard muttered to himself, but he kept walking. The few early morning joggers and dog walkers they passed gave him curious looks. He must have been quite a sight, a man in his 70s, still in his morning robe, following. A kitten down the street with a coffee mug in his hand. They turned on to Cedar Street, where the houses grew older and grander. Howard knew this area well, though he hadn't ventured down this way in decades. The Victorian houses here had been the pride of Millbrook once, before the newer developments began sprouting up on the town's outskirts. Now most of them had been divided into apartments or converted into offices. The kitten led him to the very end of Cedar Street, where the pavement gave way to gravel. There, set back from the road behind an overgrown garden, stood the Aldrich, a house. Howard's steps faltered. Of all the places in Millbrook, it had to be this one. The house loomed before him, its once elegant facade now weather-worn and grey. Ivy had claimed the eastern wall, and the front porch sagged like a tired smile. Howard remembered when this house had been the jewel of Cedar Street, its gardens the envy of the neighborhood. Elizabeth Aldrich had tended those gardens herself, even in her 80s. Now weeds grew wild among the remnants of her prized roses. The grey kitten had disappeared through a gap in the wrought-iron fence. Howard stood at the gate, his coffee now cold and forgotten in his hand. He hadn't been this close to the Aldrich house since that summer evening in 1962. The memories he'd spent decades burying began to surface like old bones after a storm. A flash of grey caught his eye. The kitten had reappeared on the front porch, sitting expectantly by the door. Howard's hand trembled as he pushed open the gate. It creaked in protest, the sound sharp in the morning quiet. The front path, once laid with neat brick pavers, had buckled from years of frost and neglect. Howard picked his way carefully between the weeds, acutely aware that he was trespassing. But no one had lived here since Elizabeth Aldrich passed away 15 years ago. The house had been tied up in some legal battle between distant relatives, or so he'd heard. As he reached the porch steps, something caught his eye. Half hidden beneath a tangle of dead vines was a loose brick in the foundation. Howard knew that brick, knew exactly what lay beneath it. Without thinking, he set down his coffee mug and knelt, his joints protesting the movement. His fingers found the edge of the brick and pulled. There, in the small cavity behind it, lay a key exactly where it had been left 60 years ago. The brass was green with age, but Howard would have recognized it anywhere. It was the key Elizabeth had given him that summer when he'd helped tend her gardens while his father recovered in the hospital. "How did you know?" he whispered to the kitten, which only blinked at him with those knowing eyes. Howard lifted the key from its hiding place, its weight familiar yet strange in his palm. Like opening a door he'd locked long ago, memories began to flood back. The sweet scent of Elizabeth's rose garden, the sound of piano music drifting through open windows on summer evenings, and the terrible choice he'd made that changed everything. The key trembled in his hand as he approached the front door. Part of him wanted to turn back, to return to the safety of his routine and his carefully ordered life. But the grey kitten meowed softly, as if in encouragement, and Howard knew he had already crossed a point of no return. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, as if the house had been waiting for him. Howard held his breath as he turned it, the mechanism's click echoing in the morning stillness. The door opened with a low groan, releasing the musty breath of years of abandonment. The grey kitten darted between his legs and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Howard reached for a light switch out of habit, then remembered the electricity had likely been off for years. Morning light filtered through grimy windows, casting weak shadows across the entry hall's parquet flooring. His eyes were drawn immediately to the large mirror that still hung in the foyer. Its gilded frame was tarnished now, but he remembered how it used to catch the afternoon sun, filling the hall with scattered light. Through the dust and age spots, his reflection stared back at him, a ghost of white hair and wrinkles where he half expected to see his younger self. "Hello?" he called out softly, though he knew no one would answer. His voice seemed to be absorbed by the thick dust that covered everything. The house felt like a tomb, preserved exactly as it had been left, waiting for someone to break its spell. To his right stood the formal parlour, its furniture still draped with yellowed sheets like patient spectres. He could make out the shape of Elizabeth's grand piano beneath one of them, its silence a rebuke to the memories of music that once filled these rooms. How many evenings had he spent here, listening to Elizabeth play Chopin while her granddaughter. Margaret turned the pages. The grey kitten reappeared at the foot of the grand staircase, its white chest marking visible even in the dim light. It meowed once, then began to climb the stairs. Howard hesitated. The stairs might not be safe after so many years, but something pulled him forward, the same inexorable force that had led him here. His hand found the banister, smooth mahogany beneath years of dust. Each step brought a fresh creak from the old wood, but the stairs held firm. As he ascended, the walls drew his attention. Family photographs still hung in their frames, though, faded and clouded with age. He paused halfway up, drawn to a particular image. Through the dust and dimness, he could make out a summer scene. A garden party, women in flowered dresses, men in light suits. His younger self stood at the edge of the frame, half-turned as if trying to escape the camera's eye. And there, in the center, Elizabeth Aldrich presided over her famous rose garden, one hand resting on her granddaughter Margaret's shoulder. Margaret. The name sent a sharp pain through his chest. He forced himself to look at her face in the photograph, 17 years old, dark hair caught in the summer breeze, smiling with all the confidence of youth. She didn't know then what was coming. None of them did. The kitten's meow drew his attention back to the present. It had reached the top of the stairs and sat waiting by a closed door, the door to Elizabeth's study. Howard knew that room well. He'd spent countless hours there that summer, cataloguing Elizabeth's extensive library while she told him stories of old Millbrook, of the families whose histories were as intertwined as the roots of her roses. His feet carried him up the remaining stairs of their own accord. The door's brass handle was cold under his palm, its surface dulled by time, but still solid. As he turned it, he noticed his hand was shaking. The door swung open with a whisper of protest, and the musty air that escaped carried with it the faint scent of leather and old paper. The study looked exactly as he remembered, yet completely different. Dust motes danced in the thin shaft of light from its single window. Bookshelves still lined the walls, their leather-bound contents standing in silent formation. Elizabeth's massive oak desk dominated the room. its surface covered with papers that looked as if they'd been left mid-task, waiting for her return. The grey kitten padded across the oriental carpet and jumped onto the desk with surprising agility. It walked carefully between the scattered papers and sat down next to a leather-bound journal that Howard recognized immediately. His heart seemed to stop in his chest. It was Elizabeth's diary, the one she'd always kept locked in her desk drawer, the one that held all the secrets of the Aldrich family, and perhaps his own secret as well. The kitten placed one paw on the journal and looked at him expectantly, as if to say, "This is why I brought you here." Howard moved toward the desk in a daze, his fingers reaching for the journal of their own accord. As he lifted it, a photograph slipped from between its pages and fluttered to the floor. He bent to retrieve it and found himself staring into a face he'd tried for 60 years to forget. The photograph trembled in Howard's hands, a black and white image of a young man in an Air Force uniform, his smile confident and untouched by time. His own face, preserved from 1962, stared back at him. Written on the back in Elizabeth's elegant script were 3 words that made his throat tighten: "Our Howard's return." He couldn't bear to look at it any longer. Slipping the photo back into the journal, he placed both on the desk and turned away. The kitten watched him from its perch, tail twitching slightly. "What else do you want me to see?" he asked softly. As if in answer, a sound drifted up from below, so faint he might have imagined it, a whisper of static, like a radio searching for its station. Howard froze, listening intently. There it was again, coming from the first floor. The kitten was already heading for the stairs. Howard followed, his heart beating faster than it should. The sound grew clearer as they descended, definitely a radio, its signal weak but unmistakable. It seemed to be coming from the living room. Elizabeth's living room had once been the heart of the house. Now it lay in shadow, heavy drapes still drawn across the windows. But there on the mahogany side table sat the vintage Philco radio that had been Elizabeth's pride and joy. Its dial glowed faintly in the dimness, impossible though that seemed. Howard approached it cautiously. The radio's cabinet still gleamed beneath its layer of dust, the Art Deco details as elegant as he remembered. But it couldn't possibly be working. The electricity had been off for years, yet as he drew closer, music emerged from the static. Faint, but clear enough to recognize. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade, the very song that had been playing that summer evening when everything changed. His hands moved of their own accord, fingers finding the frequency dial. The music faded, replaced by a news broadcast. The announcer's voice, scratchy but distinct. July 15th, 1962. Temperature expected to reach 85 degrees by afternoon in local news. Howard jerked his hand back as if burned. July 15th, 1962. The day before it all fell apart. The radio went silent, its glow fading like a dying firefly. The grey kitten sat beside the radio, its white chest marking seeming to pulse in the dim light. Howard sank into Elizabeth's favorite armchair, a cloud of dust rising around him. The chair's fabric was worn thin, but he could still catch the ghost of her perfume, roses and lavender. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, taking in details he'd missed at first. The room was exactly as it had been, down to the Life magazine. On the coffee table, its cover showing John Glenn's historic orbit of Earth, everything preserved like a museum exhibit dedicated to that fatal summer. On the mantelpiece, family photographs tracked the Aldrich history. Howard found himself drawn to them, though he knew what he would find. Elizabeth and her husband Charles on their wedding day, their daughter Caroline's graduation from Vassar, and Margaret, always Margaret, growing from a solemn child to a radiant young woman. The last photo had been taken right here in this room. Margaret at the piano, her dark hair falling forward as she played, while Howard stood behind her, watching, with an expression he now recognized as love. Elizabeth had taken the picture without their knowledge. "You two make such beautiful music together," she'd said when she showed it to them. A week later, Howard would make the decision that would haunt him for the next 60 years. The kitten jumped onto the piano bench and walked across the yellowed keys. A discordant note rang out, startling in the silence. Sheet music still sat on the stand, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Margaret's favorite piece. The pages were brown with age, but the notes were clear enough to read. Howard turned away from the piano, but his eyes fell on something else. A small wooden box, tucked half behind a stack of old Reader's Digest magazines. He knew that box, had spent hours staring at it that summer, wondering if he dared to open it. Elizabeth's recipe box, she'd called it. But Howard had seen her slip things into it that had nothing to do with cooking. Letters, documents, the kind of papers people hide when they have secrets to keep. The kitten leaped down from the piano and padded over to the box, looking up at Howard with those knowing eyes. "You want me to find everything, don't you?" Howard whispered. "Every last secret?" The kitten blinked slowly, a gesture he chose to take as confirmation. With hands that shook only slightly, Howard reached for the box. The wood was smooth under his fingers, warmed by the thin sunlight that had found its way through the drapes. The lid opened with a soft creak, releasing the scent of old paper and faded ink. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed recipe cards, lay an envelope addressed to him in Elizabeth's handwriting. "For Howard," it read. "To be opened when you're ready to face the truth." Howard carried Elizabeth's envelope back upstairs to the study, the grey kitten following silently at his heels. The morning light had strengthened, casting long shadows through the study's east-facing window. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, stirred by his passage. He settled into Elizabeth's desk chair, its leather creaking softly beneath him. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, weighted with more than just paper. For a moment, he simply sat there, studying his name written in Elizabeth's elegant script. Even her handwriting had possessed a certain grace, each letter precisely formed, yet flowing naturally into the next. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" he murmured, more to himself than to the kitten, which had resumed its position on the desk beside Elizabeth's journal. The envelope wasn't sealed. Its flap had been tucked in, preserved by decades of stillness. Howard drew out a single sheet of paper, the creamy stationery yellowed at the edges, but otherwise intact. The letter was dated July 16th, 1962, the day everything changed. "My dear Howard," he read aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper. "By the time you read this, I imagine many years will have passed. I know you well enough to know that once you left Millbrook, your sense of honor and shame would keep you from returning. But I also know that someday, when the time is right, you will find your way back to this house and these memories. I want you to understand that I never blamed you for what happened. You were young, faced with an impossible choice. We all were, in our own ways. The truth about Margaret and the baby..." Howard's hands trembled so violently that the letter slipped from his grasp, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. The kitten jumped down and batted at it playfully, pushing it back toward his feet. "I can't," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew he had to continue. He'd carried the weight of that summer for 60 years. Perhaps it was finally time to set it down. He retrieved the letter, smoothing it carefully before continuing to read. "The truth about Margaret and the baby is more complicated than you know. There are things I couldn't tell you then, things I couldn't tell anyone. But they're all here, in my journal, every secret, every decision, every consequence. I'm not writing this to burden you with old griefs, dear Howard. I'm writing because you deserve to know the whole truth. Margaret wasn't the only one keeping secrets that summer. Start with the entry from May 3rd, 1962. That's when it all began, though none of us knew it then. And Howard, forgive yourself. We all did what we thought was right at the time. With love and hope for your peace, Elizabeth." The journal sat on the desk where he'd left it, its leather binding cracked with age. Howard opened it carefully, the spine crackling in protest. Elizabeth's neat handwriting filled page after page, a meticulous record of that fateful summer. He found the May 3rd entry easily enough. The kitten settled next to him, as if preparing to read along. May 3rd, 1962. Today, I learned something that changes everything. Dr. Morrison called with Margaret's test results. The condition is hereditary, just as we feared. But there's more to it than that. When I pressed him for details, he revealed something that makes me question everything I thought I knew about our family. Howard's eyes widened as he read on. The truth Elizabeth had carried all those years was far more shocking than anything he'd imagined. Pages fell away as he read entry after entry, each revelation leading to another, building a picture so different from what he'd believed. May turned to June in the journal's pages. Elizabeth had recorded everything. The secret meetings with Dr. Morrison, the late-night conversations with Margaret, the mysterious phone calls from someone identified only as C. Through it all ran a thread of desperate hope and determination. Then he reached the entry for July 15th, the day before everything fell apart. The day he'd heard Glenn Miller on the radio and made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. But before he could read that entry, a floorboard creaked behind him. Howard spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway's darkness. A familiar voice, aged by time but unmistakable, broke the silence. "I had a feeling I'd find you here today." Howard's breath caught in his throat as Margaret Aldrich stepped into the study. 60 years had silvered her dark hair and lined her face, but her eyes were exactly as he remembered them, deep brown and unflinching. The grey kitten immediately padded over to her, rubbing against her ankles as if they were old friends. "Hello, Howard," Margaret said softly. "I see you've met Luna." "Luna?" His voice cracked on the word. "My kitten." Margaret bent to scratch behind the little cat's ears. "She has a habit of leading people where they need to go." Howard's mind struggled to process what was happening. You sent her." "Not exactly." Margaret moved further into the room, her hand trailing along the dusty bookshelf. "Luna started showing up at my house a month ago. When she led me here last week, I knew it was time. I've been coming back every morning, waiting for me," Howard said. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded, her eyes falling on the open journal on the desk. "I see you've found Grandmother's diary." Howard looked down at the pages before him, then back at Margaret. "Why now? After all these years?" "Because it's time you knew the truth." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a worn leather photo album. "And because of this," she placed the album on the desk beside the journal. The leather was cracked with age, but the gold embossing still caught the light. "Aldrich family, 1960-1965. I found this last month while cleaning out my mother's house," Margaret explained, pulling up the room's other chair. "It was hidden in the back of her closet. There are pictures in here I've never seen before, pictures that tell a very different story than the one we thought we knew." Howard's hands trembled as he opened the album. The first photograph showed Elizabeth in her garden, but it wasn't one he remembered. She was standing with a man he didn't recognize, both of them looking serious as they examined a document. "That's Charles Morrison," Margaret said quietly. "The doctor from Grandmother's journal. The one who knew about my condition." Howard turned the page. More unfamiliar images emerged. Elizabeth at what appeared to be a medical conference, dated March 1962. A series of photographs showing her in intense discussion with various doctors and researchers. Then a picture that made his heart stop. Elizabeth and Margaret at a hospital in Boston, standing next to a doctor whose name tag read, Dr. C. Reynolds. "C," Howard whispered, remembering the mysterious initial from Elizabeth's journal entries. "Dr. Catherine Reynolds," Margaret confirmed. "She was pioneering new treatments for my condition, treatments that weren't approved in the U.S. yet. Grandmother had been working with her in secret for months before that summer." The next page held a series of photographs that seemed to have been taken in quick succession at one of Elizabeth's garden parties. Howard recognized himself in the background of each one, watching Margaret at the piano, but there was something else, something he'd never noticed before. In each shot, Elizabeth was passing something to Dr. Morrison. An envelope, a file, what? Looked like medical records. She was building a case, Margaret explained, her voice thick with emotion, gathering evidence, making connections, trying to find a way to get me into Dr. Reynolds' treatment program without anyone knowing. If word had gotten out about my condition, your father would have lost everything, Howard finished. The pieces were starting to fit together. The bank presidency, his position on the hospital board, his reputation, Margaret added bitterly. The only thing he really cared about. More photographs followed. Margaret's father looking stern at his desk, unaware he was being photographed. A series of letters partially visible on his blotter, their letterhead showing the name of a genetic research center. Elizabeth's handwritten notes on the back of each photo, documenting dates, times, and overheard conversations. Grandmother was building a case against him too, Margaret said softly. She knew he was suppressing research into genetic conditions like mine, blocking funding, burying studies that might have helped others like me, all to protect the family name. The final photograph in the album showed Margaret and Howard on the day everything changed. They were in the garden, his Air Force uniform, crisp and new, her face turned up to his with trust and love. But it was the background that drew his attention now, Elizabeth standing at her study window, watching them with an expression he could finally read. Not disappointment, as he'd always thought, but determination. "When you left that day," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we all thought it was because you couldn't handle the truth about my condition, about the baby. But that wasn't it, was it?" Howard closed the album gently, his vision blurring with unshed tears. "Your father came to see me that morning. He had proof that Elizabeth was working with Dr. Reynolds, said if I didn't leave immediately, he'd expose everything. The experimental treatments, the secret medical trials, all of it. Elizabeth would have gone to prison. And you thought you were protecting us by leaving," Margaret said. "Oh, Howard, we were all trying to protect each other and we all got it wrong." The grey kitten, Luna, jumped onto the desk between them, her white chest marking glowing in the strengthening morning light. She placed one paw on the closed photo album, then on Elizabeth's journal, as if connecting the two pieces of the puzzle. "There's more," Margaret said, reaching for the journal. "So much more. Are you ready to hear it all?" Margaret opened Elizabeth's journal to a page marked with a faded silk ribbon. Several letters fell out, their edges worn soft with age. She handed the first one to Howard, her hands steady, while his trembled. "This is where it really began," she said. "Read it." The letter was written on hospital stationery, dated April 15th, 1962. "Dear Elizabeth, the results of Margaret's genetic testing confirm our worst fears, but there may be hope. Dr. Reynolds' work in Boston shows remarkable promise. The treatments are experimental, yes, but the early results are beyond anything we've seen. I understand the need for discretion. Your son-in-law's position makes this delicate, but time is of the essence, especially given Margaret's condition. With deepest concern, Charles Morrison, M.D. Howard looked up at Margaret. "Your condition was it fatal?" she said quietly. "Without treatment, I had maybe 5 years. The baby would have had less." The weight of this truth settled over Howard like a heavy blanket. All these years, he'd thought he'd left to protect Elizabeth from scandal, but Margaret had been fighting for her life. The next letter was written in Elizabeth's elegant hand, addressed to Dr. Catherine Reynolds. "My dear Catherine, the samples you requested are enclosed. Margaret doesn't know I took them. Forgive me this deception, but I fear my son-in-law watches her too closely. Your last letter gave me hope. If your treatment can truly alter the genetic sequence, then perhaps... But I must be careful. George has allies on the hospital board. Just yesterday, I overheard him on the phone, working to discredit your research. He would rather see his daughter die than risk the family name being associated with genetic imperfection, as he calls it. Time grows short. Margaret suspects she's with child, though she's told no one but me. If she is, everything becomes more urgent. With desperate hope, Elizabeth, I never knew, Howard whispered, about any of this. None of us knew everything, Margaret replied. Grandmother kept each of us in the dark about different parts, trying to protect everyone. The third letter made Howard's heart stop. It was his own handwriting in a letter he'd never sent. Dear Margaret, by the time you read this, if you ever read this, I'll be gone. Your father came to me with photographs, proof of your grandmother's secret meetings with Dr. Reynolds. He says he'll expose everything unless I leave immediately. Elizabeth would face charges for her part in the unauthorized treatments. I love you enough to leave you. Maybe someday you'll understand. Howard. But I never got this letter, Margaret said softly. Where was it all this time? The answer lay in the next envelope, a letter from Elizabeth to Howard, dated the very day he left. Howard, I found your letter to Margaret in the garden. Forgive me, but I read it, and I cannot let you sacrifice yourself this way. George's threats against me are meaningless compared to Margaret's life. By the time you read this, she and I will be in Boston. Dr. Reynolds is waiting for us. The treatment will take months, but it's her only chance. I'm leaving this with my journal, hoping someday you'll find your way back to the truth. What George doesn't know is that I've been gathering evidence of his efforts to suppress medical research. If he moves against any of us, it all goes to the newspaper. Sometimes the only way to protect those we love is to be willing to lose everything else. You're a good man, Howard. Too good, perhaps. But Margaret needs more than a protector right now. She needs someone who will fight alongside her, not for her. The choice is yours, but know this, love without trust is just another form of control. With hope for your return, Elizabeth. Luna jumped into Howard's lap as he finished reading, purring. Softly, outside, the morning had fully arrived, sunlight streaming through the study windows. Margaret reached over and took his hand, her touch as familiar as if no time had passed. I survived, you know, she said quietly. Dr. Reynolds' treatment worked. The genetic sequence was altered just enough. The baby, she paused, squeezing. His hand. Our daughter lived too. Howard's world tilted on its axis. Our daughter? Margaret reached into her handbag and pulled out one final photograph, a recent one, showing a woman in her late 50s with Howard's eyes and Margaret's smile standing in front of a medical building. The sign behind her read, Reynolds Genetic. Research Center. Elizabeth, Margaret said. We named her after my grandmother. She's a genetic researcher now, continuing Dr. Reynolds' work. She's the one who finally helped me understand the full story of that summer. And she very much wants to meet you. Howard sat in stunned silence, the photograph of his daughter trembling in his hands. Luna curled tighter in his lap, her purring a steady comfort against the thundering of his heart. Elizabeth. He whispered the name. Our Elizabeth. She has your determination, Margaret said softly, and my grandmother's spirit. There's more I need to show you in the master bedroom. They climbed the stairs together, their footsteps stirring dust from the faded carpet runner. Luna led the way, her tail held high like a beacon. The master bedroom door was closed, its brass handle tarnished but still elegant. Margaret hesitated before turning it. I haven't been in here since the morning we left for Boston. The door opened with a whisper of protest. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the preserved scene before them. The massive four-poster bed still wore its blue and white quilt, though the colors had faded to ghostly echoes of themselves. On the dressing table, Elizabeth's silver-backed brush and mirror set waited, as if she'd just stepped away. But it was the maple wood music box on the bedside table that drew Margaret's attention. She crossed the room and lifted it carefully, her fingers finding the hidden catch that Howard had never known existed. The secret compartment, she explained, as a false bottom clicked open. Grandmother kept her most precious things here. From the hidden space, she withdrew a small package wrapped in silk. As she unfolded it, a delicate melody began to play from the music box's mechanism. Brahms' Lullaby, the same tune Elizabeth had hummed while tending her roses. Inside the silk lay a silver baby rattle, its surface engraved with a date, December 25th, 1962. Elizabeth's first Christmas, Margaret said. Grandmother had it made while we were in Boston, certain the treatment would work. She handed Howard the rattle. Its weight in his palm made everything suddenly, achingly real. This was his daughter's first toy, a gift he'd never known existed. "There's more," Margaret continued, reaching back into the compartment. She pulled out a small diary, different from the one they'd found in the study. "This was my private journal from that summer. I want you to see what I wrote the day you left." Howard opened the diary with trembling fingers. Margaret's youthful handwriting filled the pages. July 16th, 1962. "Howard is gone. Father says he left because he couldn't handle the truth about my condition, about the baby. But I don't believe it. The Howard I know would never run from a fight. Not one that mattered. Grandmother says to trust her, that everything will make sense in time. She has a plan, she says. Dr. Reynolds is waiting for us in Boston. I should be scared, but strangely I'm not. When I hold my hand over my stomach, I can feel the rightness of this path. This baby, our baby, deserves every chance. Howard, wherever you are, I hope someday you'll understand why we had to do things this way. The treatment might not work. Dr. Reynolds has been honest about the risks. But isn't that what love is? Taking the chance? Fighting the impossible fight? Believing in something bigger than fear? I'll name her Elizabeth if she's a girl. A name that means God's promise. Because that's what she is. A promise that love is stronger than genetics. Stronger than fear. Stronger even than family duty. Howard, if you ever read this, know that I forgive you. And I hope someday you'll forgive us for not telling you the whole truth. Grandmother says sometimes secrets are like seeds. They have to lie in darkness before they can grow into something beautiful. Howard closed the diary gently, his vision blurred. Luna jumped onto the bed beside him, her white chest marking luminous in a shaft of sunlight. "She's retiring next month," Margaret said quietly. "Our Elizabeth, the genetic treatment she helped develop, the one that saved both of us, has just been approved by the FDA. She's coming home to Millbrook to establish a research center here. That's why I knew it was time to find you." Howard looked up sharply. "She's coming here?" "Next week." Margaret smiled. "She bought this house, Howard. She's going to restore it, turn it into a home again, and she very much hopes her father will help with the garden. I told her you had quite a way with roses." The basement door creaked open reluctantly, revealing narrow wooden stairs descending into shadow. Howard found an old flashlight in a kitchen drawer, its beam weak but sufficient to light their way. Luna darted down ahead of them, her grey form almost ghost-like in the dim light. "Grandmother kept everything important down here," Margaret said, following the kitten. She called it her archive. The basement was surprisingly dry, protected from moisture by Elizabeth's careful planning. Metal shelving units lined the walls, each loaded with carefully labeled boxes. The beam of the flashlight caught the neat organization system. Medical research, 1960, 1965, hospital board minutes, George Aldrich correspondence. Luna sat expectantly by a box marked Millbrook Herald Archives, 1962. As Margaret pulled it from the shelf, a cloud of dust made them both sneeze. "Here," she said, setting the box on an old workbench. "This is what I found last week." The first newspaper clipping was from June 1962. The headline read, "Aldrich Bank President Challenges New Medical Research Facility." Below was a photograph of Margaret's father, George Aldrich, looking stern behind his massive desk. "He fought so hard to prevent the Genetic Research Center from opening in Millbrook," Margaret explained. "We never understood why until now." The next clipping revealed more. Local doctor questions ethics of genetic testing. The article quoted an anonymous source, claiming that genetic screening could destroy the fabric of society by revealing undesirable traits in prominent families. "Father wasn't just protecting our family secret," Margaret said quietly. He was protecting all the old families in Millbrook. So many of them had genetic conditions they were hiding. Howard's flashlight beam caught another headline. Boston. Research Center claims breakthrough in genetic treatment. The article was dated just days before he'd left town. Dr. Catherine Reynolds's photo showed a determined woman in her 40s standing in a laboratory, but it was the smallest clipping. That proved most revealing. Tucked between the pages was a personal notice that had never run. Dr. George Aldrich regrets to announce the death of his daughter, Margaret, from complications of a hereditary condition. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the clipping. He had it prepared. If the treatment hadn't worked, he was going to announce my death rather than admit I'd sought experimental treatment. Your own father? Howard's voice trailed off in disbelief. There's more, Margaret said, pulling out a thick folder from the bottom of the box. Inside were dozens of letters from other prominent Millbrook families, all addressed to George. Aldrich? Each one detailed genetic conditions they were hiding. Heart defects, neurological disorders, blood diseases. He was blackmailing them, Howard realized. Using their secrets to maintain his power. And using their fear to block medical progress, Margaret added. Any research that might expose these conditions was a threat to his position. Luna jumped onto the workbench, pawing at another folder they hadn't noticed. This one was marked, simply, Victory. Inside was a single newspaper clipping from December 1962, its headline bold and clear. Boston genetic treatment success brings hope to thousands. Below the headline was a photo that made Howard's heart stop. Elizabeth stood beaming beside Dr. Reynolds, and in Elizabeth's arms was a tiny bundle. There, Elizabeth, just days old, her treatment already a success. Margaret touched the photo, gently. Grandmother made sure this was published in every major newspaper, not just for the medical breakthrough, but as protection. Once the story was public, Father couldn't hide it anymore, couldn't hide any of it. A smaller article on the same page caught Howard's eye. Millbrook Bank president resigns amid investigation. George Aldrich's downfall had been swift and complete. Elizabeth saved more than just me, Margaret said softly. She saved all those families from living in fear. The genetic research center she's opening here, it's not just about medicine, it's about finishing what her namesake started, making sure no one has to hide who they are anymore. The flashlight beam flickered, reminding them of the passage of time. But before they could close the box, Luna batted at one final envelope they hadn't noticed. Inside was a letter from Elizabeth to Dr. Reynolds, dated the day after Howard left. My dear Catherine, the piece is in place, though the cost was high. Young Howard's departure has given us the opening we need. George believes he's won, which will make his fall all the more complete. Keep Margaret safe. Keep our grandchild safe. When the treatment succeeds, and it will succeed, we'll build something here in Millbrook that will help thousands. Sometimes the greatest victories require the deepest sacrifices. And Catherine, when the time is right, make sure Howard knows he didn't fail us. He played his part perfectly, though he didn't. Know it. The love he and Margaret share will bloom again, like my roses after winter, with determination, Elizabeth. The Millbrook Public Library stood exactly as Howard remembered it, its red brick facade and white columns, a testament to small-town permanence. He and Margaret climbed the worn stone steps together, leaving Luna to wait in Margaret's car. Inside, the air held the familiar mustiness of old books and older memories. Howard had spent countless hours here during that summer of '62, researching genetic conditions in medical texts while pretending to study for his Air Force qualifying exams. Mrs. Chen? Margaret called softly to the elderly librarian at the desk. I called earlier about accessing the historical records. Alice Chen looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. Margaret Aldrich, she breathed, and Howard Mitchell. I wondered if I'd ever see you two together again. You remember us? Howard asked. Alice smiled. I was just starting here that summer. Young love is hard to forget, especially when it's mixed up with all that drama. I've kept everything from that time period in the special collections room. Follow me." She led them through the stacks to a small room in the back. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and a large table dominated the center. Alice pulled out several boxes labeled Town Records, 1960, 1965, and Medical Board Minutes. "I've already pulled the relevant materials," she said, then hesitated. "There's something else you should see." She disappeared into the stacks and returned with a bound volume. The library's private journal from that period. The head librarian kept track of certain things. The journal's first entry was dated May 1962. EA requested medical texts again today. GA came by later asking what she'd been reading. Told him we'd switched to computer records and lost the data. Some questions shouldn't be answered. The whole town was involved, Margaret said softly, everyone choosing sides in their own way. Howard opened one of the medical board files. Minutes from a June 1962 meeting showed heated debate about genetic research funding. George Aldrich's voice dominated the discussion, arguing against experimental treatments that could damage reputations. But it was a small note in the margin that caught his attention. Dr. M signals approval of Boston Protocol. EA, plan proceeding. Dr. Morrison, Margaret explained. He was keeping grandmother updated through these notes. Father never bothered to read the minutes carefully. Alice brought them more files. Property records showing the transfer of the Victorian house to a trust, insurance documents protecting Elizabeth's assets, medical board correspondence. Each piece added to the puzzle. "Here," Alice said, pulling out a thick folder. "These are the letters Dr. Reynolds sent to Elizabeth. I kept them hidden in the rare book section all these years." The letters revealed the full scope of Elizabeth's plan. She had been laying the groundwork for years, gathering allies, documenting evidence, preparing for the moment when everything would align. One letter stood out, dated just weeks before Howard's departure. "Dear Elizabeth, the treatment protocol is ready. Your evidence against George is comprehensive and damning, but are you certain about the young man? Using his departure as cover is clever, but the cost to both him and Margaret. Still, I understand the necessity. Once George believes he's won, his guard will drop. Sometimes we must sacrifice immediate happiness for lasting change. With admiration, Catherine." "She orchestrated everything," Howard said, his voice rough with emotion. "Even my leaving. To protect all of us," Margaret added. "Look at this." She held up a newspaper article from 1963. "Millbrook Memorial Hospital opens genetic research wing." The accompanying photo showed Elizabeth and Dr. Reynolds cutting a ribbon, while in the background, a much younger Alice Chen could be seen applauding. "That was just the beginning," Alice said. After George's resignation, Elizabeth and Dr. Reynolds started bringing other families forward. People began talking about their conditions openly, sharing stories, supporting each other. It changed everything. Howard found himself staring at a photograph he'd never seen before. It showed Elizabeth in her garden, holding an infant. There, Elizabeth, while Margaret looked on. The baby wore a distinctive silver rattle. "I took that picture," Alice said softly. "Elizabeth wanted to document everything. She said someday the whole story would need to be told." A final document lay at the bottom of the box, a letter addressed to Howard, written in Alice's neat hand and dated July 1962. "Dear Howard, Elizabeth asked me to write this for the record. You haven't failed anyone. Your love for Margaret, your willingness to leave to protect her family, these are not weaknesses. Someday, when the truth can finally be told, remember that you were part of something larger than yourself. Your sacrifice helped change not just one family, but an entire town's understanding of what it means to love without conditions. Keep faith, Alice Chen, Chief Librarian." The late morning sun streamed through the library's tall windows as Howard sat with the family Bible that Alice had brought them. Its leather binding was worn smooth with age, the pages filled with generations of births, deaths, and marriages recorded in different hands. "Elizabeth added this after you left," Margaret said, turning to an entry that made Howard's heart clench. Elizabeth Rose Aldrich Mitchell, born December 18th, 1962. Mother, Margaret Aldrich. Father, Howard Mitchell. Born of love, saved by grace. Below the entry was a carefully pressed rose petal, its deep blue color still vivid after all these years. "From the midnight blue rose," Howard whispered, "the one we planted together. Grandmother kept it blooming all those years," Margaret said. "She said it was her promise that you'd come back someday." Howard traced his daughter's name with a trembling finger. "I thought I was protecting you by leaving. All this time, I believed I'd failed you both." "You didn't fail anyone," came Alice's voice as she set a heavy box on the table. Elizabeth knew exactly what she was doing. "Look at this." She pulled out a detailed timeline written in Elizabeth's elegant hand. Every event had been mapped out. Howard's departure, Margaret's secret journey to Boston, George's downfall, the public revelation of the treatment's success. Even the timing of Howard's return had been anticipated. "July 16th, 1962, Howard read aloud. "Howard leaves, giving George false sense of victory. Margaret's absence can now be attributed to heartbreak rather than treatment. Phase 1 complete." The timeline continued through months of careful orchestration. Each move had been calculated to protect not just Margaret and the baby, but to create lasting change in Millbrook. "But why didn't anyone tell me?" Howard asked, his voice rough with emotion. "All these years." "Because your reaction had to be genuine," Margaret explained softly. "Your pain, your sense of loss. It had to be real for George to believe he'd won. Even I didn't know the full plan until after Elizabeth was born." Howard found another entry in the Bible, added in a different hand, Dr. Reynolds' precise script. "Treatment successful. Genetic sequence successfully modified. Mother and child both healthy. A new chapter in medical history begins." Alice brought them one final document, a letter sealed with the hospital's official stamp, dated just last week. "Dear Dr. Elizabeth Aldrich Mitchell, the Board of Directors is pleased to approve your proposal for the Millbrook Center for Genetic Research and Treatment. Your grandmother's original vision of accessible genetic healthcare for all families will finally be realized. Construction begins next month on the site of the old Aldrich Bank building. Congratulations, Dr. James Morrison, Jr., Chief of Medicine." "Morrison's son," Margaret explained. "The next generation carrying forward the work." Howard stared at the letter, then at the family Bible, and finally at Margaret. 60 years of guilt and regret began to transform into something else. Understanding, acceptance, even a kind of peace. "She knew," he said wonderingly. "Elizabeth knew that someday it would all come full circle. That's why she left all these breadcrumbs for us to follow." "She knew love would bring you back," Margaret said, taking his hand. "Real love always finds its way home." Through the library window, they could see Luna sitting in Margaret's car, her white chest marking bright in the sunlight. The kitten had led Howard not just to the house, but to the truth he'd needed to find for 60 years. "Our daughter," Howard said, the words still new and wonderful on his tongue. "When does her train arrive?" "Tomorrow morning?" Margaret smiled. "She's bringing the architectural plans for the research center and her grandmother's roses. She's propagated them in her greenhouse. The midnight blue will bloom again." Howard closed the family Bible gently, its pages now holding not just the past, but the promise of the future. "Then we have work to do," he said. "That garden won't restore itself." Back at the Victorian house, Margaret discovered Elizabeth's old address book in a desk drawer, its leather cover soft with age. She and Howard sat at the kitchen table, Luna curled between them, as they began the delicate task of reaching out to family members who had been part of their story without knowing it. "Caroline first," Margaret said, touching her sister's name in the book. "She never knew why I disappeared that summer. Father told her I'd had a nervous breakdown." The phone rang 4 times before a surprised voice answered. "Margie, is that really you?" "Hello, Carrie," Margaret said softly. "There's someone here who wants to say hello." Howard's voice shook slightly as he spoke. Caroline, it's Howard Mitchell. The silence on the other end stretched for a long moment. Then, I knew it. I knew you wouldn't have just left like that. Mother told me last year, before she passed, that there was more to the story, but she didn't know the details. As Margaret explained, tears falling freely now, Howard found himself studying a photograph that had slipped from the address book. Caroline's. Wedding, 1963. Elizabeth stood proudly beside the bride, and there in her arms was baby Elizabeth, though no one knew then that the infant was his daughter. More calls followed. Dr. Morrison's widow, Emily, who had helped maintain the secret for decades. Thomas Reynolds, Catherine's son, now a genetic researcher himself. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, revealed another layer of protection and care that had surrounded them without their knowledge. The most difficult call was to George Aldrich's second wife, Patricia. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting years for this moment. I found his papers. After he died, she said quietly. All the evidence Elizabeth had gathered, the letters from other families. He kept everything, you know. I think in the end, he understood what Elizabeth had done, not just for Margaret, but for all of them. Howard discovered that Patricia had been quietly donating to genetic research for years, trying in her own way to atone for George's actions. He changed in his later years, she told them. The last thing he said to me was, "Tell Margaret she was right to fight." As the afternoon light began to fade, Margaret opened a newer address book, one that belonged to their daughter. Elizabeth had maintained connections with many of the families helped by Dr. Reynolds' treatment, creating a network of support that spanned generations. "Look at this," Margaret said, showing Howard a recent Christmas card. Their daughter stood surrounded by a group of doctors and researchers, many of them children of the original families George had tried to silence. She calls them her genetic family. Luna batted playfully at the pages as they turned them, revealing name after name, each one a thread in the tapestry Elizabeth had begun weaving 60 years ago. Howard recognized some from the old newspaper clippings, children who had received treatment after Margaret's success, now grown with families of their own. "We should invite them," Howard said suddenly. "When Elizabeth opens the research center, all of them. It's time for the whole story to be told." Margaret's eyes lit up. "A proper garden party," she said, "like grandmother used to throw. We could have it here once the roses are blooming again." They worked together into the evening, making lists, writing notes, rebuilding connections that had lain dormant for decades. Luna supervised from her perch on the windowsill, her white chest marking glowing in the lamplight like a beacon guiding them home. From somewhere in the house, the old clock Elizabeth had always kept in perfect time began to chime. Howard counted. The strikes, 7. For the first time in 60 years, he had missed his evening routine without even noticing. Instead of eating dinner alone in front of his television, he was sitting in Elizabeth's kitchen, planning a future he had never dared to imagine. "Ready to take a break?" Margaret asked, noticing his attention to the clock. "I make a pretty good beef stew these days." Howard smiled, thinking of all the dinners they had missed, all the moments lost to time and fear and misunderstanding, but also thinking of all the moments yet to come. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." The morning train pulled into Millbrook station precisely at 9:15. Howard and Margaret stood on the platform, hands clasped tightly, as passengers began to disembark. Luna sat perfectly composed at their feet, her grey fur freshly groomed for the occasion. "That's her," Margaret whispered, squeezing Howard's hand. Elizabeth Aldrich Mitchell stepped down from the train, and Howard's world shifted on its axis. She had his height, Margaret's graceful movements, and Elizabeth Senior's determined expression. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, and when she smiled, years of separation collapsed into a single moment of recognition. "Dad," she said simply, and wrapped her arms around him. Howard hadn't known until that exact moment that it was possible for a heart to break and heal in the same beat. He held his daughter close, breathing in the scent of roses that clung to her coat. Elizabeth's roses, which she'd been cultivating all these years. "I brought something for you both," Elizabeth said when they finally separated. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather portfolio. "The original treatment protocol. Dr. Reynolds gave it to me before she passed. She wanted you to have it." Inside were pages of medical notes, genetic sequences, and handwritten observations. But what caught Howard's eye was a photograph, paper-clipped, to the first page. Elizabeth Sr. and Dr. Reynolds standing over an infant incubator, their expressions intense with concentration and hope. "That's me," Elizabeth explained. "Day 3 of the treatment. Grandmother kept a complete record. She knew someday it would matter, not just for medicine, but for our family's history." They drove to the Victorian house, where Elizabeth paused, at the front gate. "It's exactly as Grandmother described it," she said softly, right down to the loose brick where she hid the key. Inside, she moved through the rooms with familiar ease, as if she'd lived there all her life. "I grew up with stories about this house," she explained. "Grandmother made sure I knew every detail. The piano where you used to play, Mum. The study where Dad would read. The garden where you fell in love." In the kitchen, she unpacked her bag, revealing several glass jars filled with dark liquid. "Rose stem cells," she explained. "We've been using them in our research. It turns out Grandmother's midnight blue roses had unique genetic properties. They're helping us develop new treatment protocols." Luna jumped onto the counter to inspect the jars, her reflection distorted in the glass. Elizabeth scratched behind her ears. "Hello, little matchmaker," she said fondly. "Mom told me how you brought them together again." The afternoon brought more arrivals. Caroline came first, bringing photographs and letters she'd saved. Then Emily Morrison, carrying her husband's medical journals. Thomas Reynolds arrived with his research team, each of them eager to meet the family that had helped pioneer their field. In Elizabeth's study, they spread out 60 years of documents across the desk: medical records, personal letters, research notes, and family photographs. Together, they began to weave together the full tapestry of their story. "Look at this," Elizabeth said, pointing to a genetic sequence chart. "This is where Grandmother and Dr. Reynolds made the breakthrough. They found a way to modify the gene without destroying its essential function. Every treatment we develop today builds on their work." Howard watched his daughter explain the science, her hands moving with the same elegant precision Elizabeth Sr. had shown in her garden. The past and present merged in her gestures, in her voice, in the way she brought clarity to complexity. "Tomorrow," Elizabeth announced, "we break ground on the new research center, but there's something else we need to do first." She led them to the garden, where fresh soil had been prepared in the old rose beds. From her bag, she produced several healthy rose cuttings, their roots carefully wrapped. "Grandmother's roses," she said, handling them with reverence, "ready to bloom again in their original soil. Who wants to help me plant them?" As the sun began to set, 3 generations of their reconstructed family worked together in Elizabeth's garden. Howard found himself kneeling in the same spot where he'd planted roses with Elizabeth Sr. all those years ago, his daughter and Margaret beside him, their hands joining his in the familiar soil. Luna supervised from the garden wall, her white chest catching the last rays of sunlight. In that moment, Howard understood what Elizabeth Sr. had known all along, that love, like her roses, could survive any winter if its roots were deep enough. After the rose planting, the family gathered in Elizabeth's study. The evening light cast long shadows through the windows as Elizabeth carefully removed a sealed envelope from her briefcase. "I found this last week," she said, "in Dr. Reynolds's personal effects. She left instructions for it to be delivered to us once we were all together." The envelope was addressed simply, "To the Aldrich Mitchell family. The complete truth. 1962. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter written in Catherine Reynolds' precise hand, dated just months before her death. "My dear ones, as the last living keeper of the complete truth, I feel it's time you understood everything that happened in 1962. Elizabeth Aldrich was more than just my patient's grandmother. She was my partner in creating a revolution in genetic medicine. It began in 1961, when Elizabeth contacted me about her suspicions regarding Margaret's condition. But what none of you knew was that Elizabeth herself had survived the same genetic disorder 30 years earlier through an experimental treatment. Developed by my mother, the treatment had been buried, dismissed as too radical by the medical establishment. George Aldrich had been instrumental in suppressing the research, fearing what might be revealed about his wife's family history. Elizabeth spent decades quietly gathering evidence, not just about the suppressed treatment, but about all the families affected by George's campaign against genetic research. Howard's arrival in Margaret's life wasn't chance. Elizabeth had known his family for years. His own mother had been one of the few survivors of that early treatment. She saw in him not just a potential match for Margaret, but a partner in her larger plan. The choice to send Howard away was the hardest decision Elizabeth ever made, but she knew that George would focus his attention on Howard's departure, allowing us to proceed with Margaret's treatment without scrutiny. Every tear, every moment of heartbreak was calculated to convince George he had won. What George never knew was that his own wife, Caroline, had been helping us all along. She was the one who provided access to his private files, the evidence that eventually forced his resignation. A mother's love for her daughter proved stronger than 30 years of secrets. The treatment Margaret received wasn't just about saving her and her baby. It was about validating decades of suppressed research, about proving that genetic conditions didn't have to be death sentences or sources of shame. Every successful treatment since then builds on what we learned with Margaret and Elizabeth. Your daughter, named so perfectly after her remarkable grandmother, carries within her the proof of what we achieved. Her own genetic sequence, now helping us develop new treatments, is a living testament to the power of love over fear, of progress over prejudice. The roses Elizabeth grew weren't just beautiful, they were part of our research. Their unique genetic stability helped us understand how to preserve essential traits while modifying harmful ones. Even in her garden, Elizabeth was pushing the boundaries of science. I'm leaving this letter with the hope that it helps heal any lingering wounds. Every choice made that summer, every deception and sacrifice served a greater purpose. You were all part of something extraordinary, a revolution in medicine that began with a grandmother's love and a young couple's courage. With eternal gratitude and admiration, Catherine Reynolds, M.D. The room fell silent as Margaret finished reading. Howard sat heavily in Elizabeth's old chair, his mind reeling with the implications. His own mother's survival, Elizabeth's careful orchestration, the true significance of the roses he'd helped tend. It was almost too much to comprehend. His Elizabeth, spoke first. "We found grandmother's original research notes last month," she said softly. "They're helping us develop treatments we never thought possible. Her roses are still saving lives." Luna jumped into Howard's lap, purring softly, as if sensing his need for comfort. Through the study window, he could see the freshly planted roses in the twilight garden. They looked small now, vulnerable, but their roots were drawing strength from soil that held 60 years of love and sacrifice. "She knew," Margaret said, wonder in her voice. "She knew everything that would happen, right from the start." "Not everything," Howard corrected gently, taking her hand. "She hoped. She planned. She sacrificed. But she couldn't have known we'd find our way back here, that our daughter would carry her work forward, that her roses would bloom again." "That's what faith is," Elizabeth said, touching the letter gently. "Planting seeds without knowing for certain they'll grow, but believing in the possibility." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. In Elizabeth's garden, decades of secrets had finally found their way into the light, and the truth, like her beloved roses, was ready to bloom again. Dawn, found Howard already in the garden, Elizabeth's old tools spread around him as he cleared decades of overgrowth from the rose beds. The house's deed lay on the garden table, signed over to his daughter just yesterday. Already the Victorians' windows had been thrown open to the morning air, and the sounds of activity drifted out. Margaret and Elizabeth inside, planning the restoration. "The foundation's solid," called Thomas Reynolds from where he was inspecting the greenhouse. "Elizabeth Sr. knew how to build things to last. We can restore it as a research greenhouse, combine the old with the new." Howard nodded, carefully pruning dead wood from around a surviving rose crown. He'd discovered several of Elizabeth's original plants still clinging to life beneath the tangles, their roots stubbornly holding on through years of neglect. Luna watched from her perch on the garden wall as cars began arriving. First came the local Historical Society volunteers, led by Alice Chen's daughter, armed with preservation guidelines and restoration expertise. Then Emily Morrison's grandson, an architect specializing in historical renovations. Throughout the morning, more people appeared, townspeople who remembered the house's glory days, younger folks eager to be part of its revival, and families whose lives had been touched by Elizabeth's work. "We found something," Elizabeth called from an upstairs window. "Dad, you need to see this." In what would become the research center's main conference room, Margaret and Elizabeth had discovered a hidden panel behind the old wallpaper. Inside was a cache of blueprints, Elizabeth's original plans for converting the house into a medical facility dated 1962. "Look at this," Elizabeth said, spreading the yellowed papers across a dust-covered table. She designed everything. Patient rooms, research laboratories, even a greenhouse specifically for developing plant-based treatments. She knew exactly what this place could become. The blueprints showed more than just structural changes. Elizabeth's neat annotations filled the margins. Sound-proofed walls for privacy, extra-wide halls for hospital beds, southern exposure for medicinal plants. She'd thought of everything, planned for a future she wouldn't live to see. "We'll follow her design," Elizabeth decided. "Update it with modern technology, but keep her vision intact." As word spread through Millbrook about the house's restoration, more help arrived. The local carpenters' union offered to donate labor. The garden club volunteered to help resurrect Elizabeth's beloved gardens. Even the town council expedited the permits, recognizing the project's significance to local history. Howard found himself working alongside people whose lives had been quietly shaped by the events of 1962. The electrician's mother had been one of the first patients to receive treatment after Margaret. The plumber's sister had benefited from Dr. Reynolds' later research. Each person who came to help carried a piece of the story. By afternoon, the house hummed with purpose. Teams moved through each room, cataloguing needs, planning repairs, preserving what could be saved. In Elizabeth's study, now destined to become the center's research library, archivists carefully documented every paper and photograph. "Found another one," called Caroline's grandson, holding up a photograph that had slipped behind a radiator. It showed Elizabeth in her garden, demonstrating rose grafting techniques to a group of medical students. She was teaching them about genetic modification using plant examples, Elizabeth explained, making complex science accessible through something familiar. As the sun began to set, Howard stood on the front porch, watching the last workers leave. The house felt different now. No longer a repository of secrets, but a promise of things to come. Margaret joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Tomorrow the contractors start on the laboratories," she said. "They'll be up and running by winter." "Elizabeth would have loved this," Howard replied. "Seeing her house come alive again, filled with purpose." Luna appeared from somewhere in the garden, proudly carrying a small object in her mouth. It was the old key Howard had found under the brick, somehow dislodged during the day's work. "We won't need it anymore," Margaret said as Howard took it from the kitten. "The new locks are being installed next week, but maybe we should keep it as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That some doors once opened lead us exactly where we need to go." The transformation of Elizabeth's Victorian unfolded like a flower opening to the sun. Each day brought new progress, new discoveries, and new connections between past and present. Howard had taken charge of the garden restoration, working from Elizabeth's meticulously detailed notebooks to recreate her vision with modern innovations. "The soil composition is remarkable," he explained to the research team as they collected samples. Elizabeth was experimenting with organic compounds that enhanced genetic stability in plants. She was doing advanced biochemistry and calling it garden preparation. The greenhouse renovation had revealed more of Elizabeth's ingenuity. Behind what appeared to be ordinary potting benches, they discovered carefully designed propagation systems that had been decades ahead of their time. Elizabeth had masked revolutionary science behind the appearance of traditional gardening. Margaret spent her days in the house's heart, directing the restoration of the rooms that would soon welcome patients and researchers. She worked from her grandmother's blueprints, but added her own touches. Spaces designed for families to gather, comfortable rooms where people could face difficult diagnoses with dignity. A grandmother understood that healing isn't just about medicine, she told the contractors. It's about creating a place where people feel safe enough to be vulnerable. Elizabeth divided her time between overseeing the installation of modern laboratory equipment and preserving the house's historical elements. She insisted on keeping the original woodwork, the grand staircase, the built-in bookcases that would now hold medical journals instead of Victorian novels. "Every piece of this house tells part of our story," she said, running her hand along a carefully restored banister. "The old and new need to coexist here, just like science and compassion." Luna had appointed herself supervisor of all activities, moving from room to room with an air of feline authority. She seemed to have a sixth sense for when workers were about to discover something significant, often appearing moments before another hidden cache of Elizabeth's papers or photographs came to light. The most remarkable discovery came during the renovation of the master bedroom. Behind a false wall, they found Elizabeth's private laboratory, a small space filled with carefully preserved specimens and research notes that bridged the gap between her gardening work and genetic medicine. She was documenting genetic variations. In her roses, Elizabeth explained, examining the perfectly preserved slides, creating a library of mutations and adaptations. These samples are invaluable to our current research. Howard often found himself pausing in his work to watch his daughter moved through the house with the same purposeful grace Elizabeth had possessed. She carried her namesake's legacy forward, not just in her work, but in the way she connected with everyone involved in the project, learning names, sharing stories, building the same kind of community that had protected their family 60 years ago. The town had embraced the project with unexpected enthusiasm. Local businesses donated materials and services. Schools organized field trips to learn about the history and science behind the restoration. People brought family photographs and letters, adding to the growing archive of Millbrook's connection to genetic research. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Howard found Margaret in Elizabeth's study. She was placing a framed photograph on the newly restored desk, the picture of young Howard and Margaret in the garden, with Elizabeth watching from the window. "I used to think she was watching us with disappointment that day," Margaret said, softly. "Now I realize she was watching love bloom, knowing it would survive whatever winter was coming. Like her roses," Howard added, joining her at the desk. "Exactly like her roses." Margaret smiled. "Did you see what Elizabeth planted today?" Together, they walked to the window. In a special bed directly below, their daughter had planted a new variety of rose she'd developed, a deep midnight blue flower with unusual genetic stability. The label read, "Elizabeth's Legacy, for all those who dare to grow through winter." Luna sat in the garden beside the new roses, her white chest catching the last light of day. Above her, the restored house stood proud against the darkening sky, its windows glowing with warm light and new purpose. Every repair, every renovation, every restored detail was a thread connecting past to present, science to nature, loss to love. "Tomorrow the first research team arrives," Margaret said. "A new chapter begins." Howard took her hand, feeling the years between them dissolve like morning frost in sunlight. "No," he said softly, "not a new chapter, a continuation of the story Elizabeth started, one that never really ended." 1 year to the day after Luna led Howard to the Victorian house, the Aldrich Mitchell Centre for Genetic Research and Treatment prepared for its grand opening. The morning sun cast rainbow patterns through the restored stained glass windows, and the scent of roses drifted in from the garden where Elizabeth's legacy bloomed in vibrant profusion. Howard stood in the front hall, adjusting his tie in the same mirror that had shown him his reflection that first morning. Now it reflected a different man, one who had found his way home to both family and purpose. Luna sat regally on the restored hallway table beside him, her grey fur gleaming, the white circle on her chest bright as a full moon. "Ready?" Margaret appeared at his side, as elegant as ever in a dress the colour of Elizabeth's midnight roses. She carried a small photo album, newly compiled to document their year of restoration and renewal. The first photograph showed the house as it had been, weathered, withdrawn, holding its secrets close. The final image, taken just yesterday, captured its transformation. Restored to its Victorian grandeur, the house now wore its history with pride while embracing its new purpose. Solar panels gleamed discreetly on the rear roof, and the restored greenhouse sparkled with state-of-the-art equipment. Elizabeth met them in the front hall, wearing a lab coat over her dress. "The first tour group is here," she said, "including some familiar faces." Through the front door came faces from the past and present. Dr. Morrison's widow, Emily, walked beside her grandson, now a genetic researcher himself. Thomas Reynolds arrived with his research team. Caroline came with her children and grandchildren. Even Patricia, George's widow, had come to witness the culmination of Elizabeth's vision. But it was the other guests who truly marked the day's significance. Families whose lives had been touched by genetic conditions, researchers working on new treatments, medical students eager to learn. The house that had once hidden secrets now opened its doors to all who sought understanding and hope. Howard led the first tour through the garden, explaining how Elizabeth's rose experiments had contributed to genetic research. Margaret guided groups through the house, pointing out where history and innovation merged. Elizabeth moved between the laboratories and treatment rooms, demonstrating how her grandmother's vision had evolved into cutting-edge medical care. In Elizabeth's study, now the center's research library, they had created a special exhibition. Photographs, letters, and documents told the full story of that summer in 1962, not as a tale of deception and loss, but as a testament to love's power to drive progress and healing. The final tour ended in the greenhouse, where Howard had first helped Elizabeth tend her roses. Now, rows of carefully cultivated plants contributed to ongoing research, while preserved specimens from Elizabeth's original garden provided vital genetic material for new studies. As evening approached, the guests gathered in the garden for the dedication ceremony. Elizabeth stood before them, her parents on either side, Luna at their feet. Behind them, the house glowed warmly in the setting sun, its windows bright with a promise. 60 years ago, Elizabeth began, in this very garden, a remarkable woman dared to believe that love could change not just hearts, but genes. My grandmother, Elizabeth Aldrich, saw beyond the limitations of her time. She understood that progress comes not just from scientific breakthrough, but from the courage to challenge what we think we know about ourselves and each other. She gestured to the blooming roses around them. These flowers represent more than beauty or scientific discovery. They remind us that growth requires both deep roots and the courage to reach for the sun, that healing comes through patience, understanding, and the willingness to believe in possibility. As if on cue, Luna rose and walked to the center of the garden, sitting precisely where the original midnight blue rose had first bloomed. Howard felt Margaret's hand slip into his as their daughter continued. Today, we honor not just my grandmother's scientific legacy, but her understanding that true progress requires both wisdom and love. This center stands as testament to her belief that every family deserves the chance to bloom, regardless of their genetic inheritance. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and purple, its light catching the windows of the house that had witnessed so much love, loss, and redemption. Howard looked at his family, the wife he had found again, the daughter he had finally met, the legacy they now carried forward together, and understood at last what Elizabeth had known all along. Some flowers are meant to bloom not just for a season, but for generations, their beauty and strength passing from root to stem to flower in an endless cycle of renewal and hope. Like Elizabeth's roses, love planted in deep soil could survive any winter, waiting for the right moment to flower again.